Why America Deserves Its Coming Judgment. This is history lesson number 2, the Pilgrims. First, let me say here that my purpose is not to make you ashamed of America or ashamed of being American, which is what the religious patriots often say when somebody starts talking about real history. My purpose here from a Christian standpoint is to break down your idol if you have one. And trust me, patriotism is an idol. The Pilgrims' landing at Plymouth Rock is the second big historical myth that we're all taught in school. It's interesting to note that the Pilgrims were far from being the first settlers. There were several other English settlements before the Pilgrims, and even before that, more than 100 years before, there were Spanish settlements in North America. There is a very plain reason why all our history books focus on the Pilgrims and their story. The reason is that the actions of the other settlers were so shameful and so unchristian that the myth makers cannot really talk about them. The first attempt at a permanent English settlement was at Roanoke, the so-called Lost Colony. These people eventually disappeared. In the year 1580, the Queen of England sent these people to establish her claim to the territory that England had mapped out in North America. All of the European countries were starting to stake their claims in the Americas because they had seen the Spanish get rich with gold after Columbus. The settlers at Roanoke were abandoned when the English were at war with the Spanish. They were left alone for almost 3 years. When the English returned, they were gone. Most historians believe that they integrated with the local Indian tribes, and of course that doesn't fit the American racial narrative. The first permanent English colony was at Jamestown. It was settled in 1607, almost 13 years before the Pilgrims landed in Massachusetts. The early history of Jamestown is largely ignored in the history books because it is so shameful. It puts the lie to the idea that the English came to America for religious freedom. They came for money. America was a corporation and a business from the very start. The first people who came to Jamestown were looking to strike it rich. They all knew the story of Columbus, how he went to the local Indian tribes and forced them into slavery to do his bidding almost immediately. But the local Indians in Virginia and North Carolina were not as helpless as the Taínos on the islands of the Caribbean. Not being interested in work, the first settlers at Jamestown found themselves starving over the first winter. They ate all their provisions, then they killed and ate their livestock. Soon they were eating mice and rats. Eventually they started eating each other. That's right, the European settlers were cannibals. Soon they were digging up bodies, both other colonists and dead Indians, and eating their flesh. As you can see, there's very little heroism in this story, and the history books generally ignore it. But nevertheless, by the time the Pilgrims were ready to leave England, the Jamestown colony was successfully exporting tobacco, and the investors were making a lot of money. So you can see against this background that people were willing to risk their lives to cross the Atlantic and come to the Americas in order to get rich. Our storybooks tell us that the Pilgrims came to America seeking religious freedom. The mythology goes like this. The Pilgrims, also known as Puritans by religion, did not like the way that the Church of England forced them to worship, so they all boarded a ship called the Mayflower and came to North America in order to practice their own religion. This, of course, is not true. Before the people who went on to become the so-called Pilgrims came to America, they moved from England to Holland, where in fact they did have religious freedom. In fact, according to some historians, there was so much religious freedom that the Pilgrims were afraid that their children would get their own ideas about worshiping the way that they wanted to. And this brings up an important point about religion. Oftentimes, people create religious doctrines for the purpose of control. As we will find out, the Pilgrims only believed in religious freedom as far as practicing religion the way that they felt was correct. The other dynamic in Pilgrim society in Holland was the fact that they claimed that they were being worked too hard. I take this to mean that they were working for someone else and not in ownership of anything because they were in a foreign country. It is apparent that at some point the Pilgrims were approached by investors who wanted them to act as labor in a new colony in the Americas. This is how all the colonies got started. The colonies were business corporations started after getting a deed from the king. Once settlers arrived, that deed would give ownership of that land to the King of England. The investors outfitted the ships and paid for everything in exchange for a number of years of free labor by the settlers. In the case of the Pilgrims, they were to work for 7 years for the corporation, after which they would be given their own land. This was the motivation, to go from being a laborer in Holland to being a landowner in North America. The only thing was that you had to risk your life to do it. Apparently, some of the Puritans that were approached by the investors rejected the deal as being too dangerous. It wasn't worth it to them. At the end of the day, the 100 or so people who left for the Plymouth colony, only 1/3 were Pilgrims. The fact that half of them died in the first year shows how dangerous this enterprise was. On top of that, there seemed to be several double crosses taking place, as the Pilgrims did not land in the Virginia colony where they were supposed to go. They landed much further north in New England, where the weather was much harsher and the first winter was deadly. Instead of trying to judge the Pilgrims' motives, let's simply look at a few historical facts about their actions. In regard to religious freedom, the Pilgrims did not believe in religious freedom at all. You might call them hypocrites, except for the fact that this piece of mythology was doubtless made up later by historians. The Pilgrims did not tolerate anyone who wanted to deviate in the slightest from their doctrine. They harassed or deported even people within their own community who had the slightest different opinion on the way to worship God. They persecuted all other Christian denominations and even killed a few heretics until the King of England demanded that they stop. The Pilgrims sanctioned slavery. It wasn't long before the Pilgrims were selling the Indians who had helped them to survive as slaves to the Caribbean. The first enslaved Africans were brought to the Pilgrim colony 2 years after the Pilgrims arrived. So we see that the true motivation for the Plymouth colony was money-making. It was a corporation started by investors in England. The Pilgrims were just the labor. To mythologize them as people seeking religious freedom is a cover for the fact that they were invaders who killed the Indians and took their land. That leads us to episode 4, the first discussion of how religion and Christianity fits into all of this.